There we go.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming along. So my name's Arlene Walker, and I'm an associate professor at Deakin University, and my background is actually organizational psychology. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our journey in the space of looking at men and their IPV experiences, but culminating in at the final study, which is we've moved right into now looking at what's actually going on in the workplace in terms of support and the reasons for that. Oh, and can I just acknowledge on the slide too, my two master students from last year, Katie and Catherine, also Kate. We collected this data 2020 and 2021, and they used this data for their thesis that they submitted last year. So acknowledging them in this as well. Next slide, thank you. Bear with me if I have to keep glancing at the slides. I did put this together very late in the early hours. I have terrible jet lag. And I apologize in advance if there's any errors that you notice on the slide. So just in terms of our background, I guess we got into this journey when, as part of a larger research group that I'm based with on my campus, we had a grant to look at alcohol and drug involvements in violence in Australia. That's what ADIVA stands for. And that was from 2014 to 2016. We were looking at all forms of violence across, and it was a personal safety survey, a large panel survey, over 5,000 participants. But some interesting things came from that led us down this track of looking at men more closely. Of our survey, there were about 40%, 42% IPV victims overall, and of those, 25% were male, approximately 25%. And I think that was probably a surprise because I will say that, you know, it hasn't been looked at really closely in Australia. And a couple of other things really came to the fore in that data. One was that help seeking in the workplace, which was the area I was interested in this survey and the study as it put those questions in, was limited across the board. That was males and females. They just don't really seek help at work. So that was the first thing that jumped out of that. When we were wrapping up the study, a good thing was taking place in the state of Victoria, where I live, was that we were having a Royal Commission into family violence. And as part of that, and particularly because we had found some very interesting things around men being victims in our survey, IPV victims, we were asked to present those findings at the Royal Commission. And that was really important because we were able to feed into the findings and the recommendations in two ways. One was men are victims, and we need to start thinking about that and what that means and what we do. But the other thing was that the workplace is central to so many victims, regardless of gender. And yet there's nothing really available in the workplace. Yes, most large organizations have a level of EAP, employee assistance programs, where people can seek help. But people weren't seeking help in any form, mainly because they feel like their jobs will be threatened. So there's still this perception you keep your work and your personal life separate. So those two things came out, and that was really important, and that led us to start a new study in 2016, which is the one that was published and people probably may or may not know about, but we published the qualitative findings from that study. The quantitative is a work in progress. But again, a really good sample. We had about 258 men. We did a snowball approach. We sent out surveys across the board. And what we found there, again, is that there was around, again, in that study, about 30% of our participants were victims. But in this study, because of what we had found previously, we decided to, and after talking to a lot of practitioners who were involved in assisting men who were victims, we decided to change the terminology because, as Denise spoke about this morning, and we all know, men do not identify as victims and they find it very difficult. So as soon as you use the term domestic violence, family violence, IPV, they tend not to respond. So we thought that we would change the terminology, and getting advice from practitioners, we changed the terminology to boundary crossing, and we provided that definition. I think that really helps us to get a very good survey response. And since then, we've spoken to various people, including Sue, who was interested in that terminology and using our survey to do some other research. So I think that was a really important study. We won't go into all the findings because the qualitative findings are published and some quantitative findings will come out. But that then led us to actually do a qualitative interview study. It took us 18 months to recruit 12 men who were willing to be interviewed to tell us their story. We took a narrative approach, basically tell us about it. We had a couple of prompters that we were interested in because I'm part of a larger group that does a lot of work around drug and alcohol and the impact of that or the influence of that in violence. You know, we had some prompters around that. But it really was an interesting study in terms of looking at how your personal experiences impact your working life and what that means in terms of seeking support. One of the things that came out of that is that the greatest impact on men's capacity to work is that their mental health and well-being is so impacted. And that is because that leads to then, because of those stressors, as we've already heard today, higher suicidal ideation, greater substance abuse use, lowered productivity, and that their employment is jeopardized. What I have in those little pink boxes are quotes that have come from the present study, but we're seeing similar themes that were coming out in that study. So now we'll go to the next slide, which is talking. So all of that background has then led us to the study we finished last year, was really then focused primarily on the workplace. Even though we did still ask men about their experiences of violence, psychological and physical, we really wanted to focus on what is the workplace doing, particularly since 2016, there were these recommendations that came out. And I will talk at the end of what we're doing there as well. So we wanted to understand how IPV impacts males working, the nature of the support and the effectiveness of that for them. We continued with our terminology of boundary crossing. Again, we had a nice sample of 204 men. We used snowball methodology. That seemed to work quite well. 89% of our participants were Australian. The age range was quite broad. Most had female partners. They were generally quite well educated, and over 50% were working full time. Go on to the next slide. Thank you. So again, a mixed method study, and in terms of the quantitative data, we assessed experience of violence using Johnson CCS, coercive control. We've used that sort of consistently, I guess, in our research. We like the measure, we just don't like necessarily the scoring. So I will say that we do some amendments there, because according to Johnson, you only have to experience one type to be classified as situational couple violence. But I'm not sure I know of one couple who doesn't raise their voice and yell when they argue. So I think you have to think about the combination, right? Which we do. But we like the item measure. And we also use the composite abuse scale, the short form revised measure in this study. And then we wanted to, so that was just to give us an idea of men's experiences and the type of violence that they're exposed to. But then we wanted to go and have a look at what's going on in the workplace. So we developed a short social withdrawal measure of 5 items to get an understanding of how men interact at work, particularly if their violence is recent. We also asked about absenteeism, because there's a lot of literature around absenteeism. We didn't ask about presenteeism in the study, which is interesting, because personally I think it's presenteeism and not absenteeism, and we certainly found that for some of the female that we've researched. Over time, the literature tells us that men, and our previous research has certainly told us that men spend more time at work to avoid the abuse at home. So it's like a place of sanctuary. And so we wanted to assess that as well. And also engagement. So we used the Bakker-Shafali short form 3-item measure of the 3 different types of engagement to see if there's a difference. In terms of our qualitative, we used again our open-ended responses. We used the boundary crossing as a definition, and we asked them to tell us what they were. So we wanted to understand if they had experienced a boundary crossing from an intimate partner, what their help-seeking behaviours were at work, how people react if they disclose to a colleague what support is available, the satisfaction with that support, and also awareness about family and domestic violence policies, because there should be policies now that should have been implemented over the last 6 years. So those were the sorts of questions that we had in the survey. Next survey. Thank you. So in terms of our quantitative findings, again, 40% of the 204 were current victims. In other words, the questions asked in the previous 12 months. Now, that's quite high and it's different to our Adiva survey, but that's also probably because of where we're recruiting. We use snowballing, but we also recruited through a men's health online newsletter. They had helped us with our qualitative study. And so we had the survey there. We've got a website that some people might be aware of in Australia called 1 in 3, around the perception 1 in 3 victims are men, and they were very helpful and they had our survey out there. But then we recruit as well through LinkedIn and Facebook and all those normal. So I think that if men self-identify as victims and we through those 2 men's health services, then that probably accounted for a higher level of victims. We had over 50% were lifetime victims. So we had current, but then we also said, had you ever experienced quite a high number. In this study, only 5% reported no experience of violence at all. So to compare the quantitative research, we looked at current victims versus everybody else, and we labeled them no recent experience of violence. So it included the 10 people that had no experience, or most of the ones that had lifetime but not current necessarily experience. The thing that's really interesting, and we have found this consistently in our research as well, is that when we ask people if you've had a boundary crossing early on in the survey, have you ever experienced, and we provide the definition, the answer is no. When men came to fill out the CCS or the composite abuse scale, their responses indicate that yes, they actually have experienced violence. They're just not recognizing it. So in this study, it was around 5% who said no to a boundary crossing, but their answers indicated either through that or in fact through some of the qualitative responses that they were victims. I think in our original Adiva survey, that was higher at around 20%. And that was a general population survey. So there seems to consistently be this percentage of men who still don't. And I think in our second male study was also around 10%. So there's always this consistent finding. The only variable that had a significant difference was on social withdrawal. So men who were current victims, in other words, it was previous 12 months, they were quite withdrawn at work, didn't interact with their colleagues and so forth, weren't going into the lunchroom, weren't going out socializing with colleagues. There were no differences on any of the other variables. The interesting finding is the no difference on engagement. That's a good thing because it's a similar thing with females. They want to go to work, work is important to them, but it's also a place of refuge. So in terms of engagement with their work, it's a good outcome. No differences in terms of overtime and absenteeism, but as I said, I think it's presenteeism that we should have assessed there. The qualitative research though, as I said, we had 40% classified as victims who either said yes to boundary crossing and then filled out those surveys, but only 25% gave us an example of a boundary crossing that was an IPV related boundary crossing. Lots of people gave us examples of boundary crossings, and I will come back to that at the end, but we can categorize them as IPV. Psychological abuse, the most common, and I think we've heard that theme consistently today. So that coercive control, that threatening behavior, a lot of it is threatening a behavior around children and harming children, etc. So it's very challenging. 88% in our sample had sought formal or informal help at work, or formal or informal help full stop. At work, it was 71%. That was a good finding for us because our previous research, it was much lower. And I think that the more we get this out there, the more people are starting to think it's okay to put up your hand and seek help. The thing is that men are still seeking help from co-workers rather than the more formal supports in the workplace. And the types of behaviors that they're experiencing from a boundary crossing at work includes harassment and stalking and, again, false allegations. And there was a quote in there about somebody who emailed the boss, and some of the things we've heard this morning as well, talking about men, false allegations against sexual abuse of children and all sorts. And that would be pretty confronting if your boss comes to tell you they've got this email from your ex-partner. But for the men that don't seek help, it's either because it's still not available, there's this gender bias, and some people also still think, although I think that number is reducing, that you just keep your personal and your work life separate. So the common theme is still there. So what does this all mean for us? And I think one of the things that we were surprised at is that 50% of our sample of men were not aware that there's any policy related to support or help. That's high, given the spotlight has very much been on since the Royal Commission around workplaces doing something. The recommendations that the Royal Commission had suggested was family violence leave be implemented into workplaces in their policy, that there's appropriate support services for people at work. Most organizations, medium to large, would have an EAP service, but more support. So having EEO officers or colleagues that you talk to or something. Respectful gender equitable cultures, because some people are still talking about, and somebody mentioned that this morning as well, that everything is geared towards women, and the wording in policies is about women and children. We have a very large movement in Australia, similar to what they have in the US about violence against women and children. We have funding bodies who will only fund research if it's about women. So like some others have said, if we're looking for funding, if you don't say that you're going to do a comparison, you probably won't get the funding. It's difficult. Dasha's smiling, it's true. And then also talking about awareness training. So awareness training for all employees, not just managers, because in our study, and this is another consistent thing, most victims seek support from a colleague. In fact, we have in one of the other studies we've done that I haven't talked about here, we have got a paper that's ready to go looking at the people who seek help from a colleague and what that experience is like for the colleague in the workplace. How do they even provide support? Where do they go? So some things have been recommended, but are they implemented? Not sure. The one that's most commonly being implemented is that family violence leave seems to be consistent now in policy. So I know even at Deakin University, I was on a committee to look at our policy around family violence, and we implemented some leave, and you can go into your leave and drop down box and there's domestic violence leave. However, after about a year, that actually disappeared off the system because some people found it too confronting. So it's difficult. You can still apply for it, but it's much more a much more difficult process now. I think, as I said, it looks like more men are seeking help at work, whether that experience is positive. I think on the previous slide, there was a percentage for most of the people seeking formal or informal help at work. Around almost 50% are still saying it's not a positive experience. I think men are still having issues with their managers. There seems to be a lack of tolerance from managers, particularly with men, that you can't bring your personal life to work. Men were talking about in their qualitative responses about asking for time to go to court. Sometimes they lost their job because they were spending too much time out of the office or on their phones. This is pre-COVID. Post-COVID, with the change in how we work and a lot of people began much more flexible working, it might be slightly different. But some policies do not mention men. In fact, there was a quote from a man said, we used to have a policy that mentioned it was inequitable. And now the wording has been changed and it only says women and children. So that's shocking, I think, in a country like Australia. The other thing is that our boundary crossing terminology may still need a bit of improvement, because what we found in this study is that despite the definition and men filling out the CCS and the abuse scale, and it was clear that they were victims, the descriptions they gave were around poor behaviors rather than intimate partner violence behavior. So they talked about their partners cheating and taking substances rather than enacting violence. And so we probably just need to do something there to tighten that up a little bit, or ask the question in different ways. First of all, if it's around normal boundary crossing, and then in relation to an intimate relationship. Okay. But there does definitely seem to be some improvements. And our research that we're about to get underway this year and early next year is now going back into workplaces, and we're actually going to look at what organizations have done since the Royal Commission in terms of what policies they have implemented. So we're going to the actual organizations and the HR people and ask what they've got and how those support services, equity, I guess, of the support services. We just need to word that nicely. But that is where we're going next. We've got a new lot of students who will be looking at that work. Thank you.